Podcasters Roundtable, round 131. The thing that Hangouts tells me is different, so I'm all distracted. Usually it just says like you're live. It's giving me a message, but it says we're live, so we're live. Welcome back. We're going to talk about how many podcasts there are. I guess usually we use Apple generically, but we're going to talk about it's what is it, 300, 800 pound? I always ask that, 800-pound gorilla. Anyways, we're going to talk about how many podcasts there are, pod fading. We're going to get into conversation about podcasts being removed from Apple and whatever else we decide to go, whatever road we decide to go down. Welcome back. It is co-host only day here on the Roundtable, and that's okay because we want to make plenty of time for Daniel, who's joining us. What's up, Daniel?
Hey, it's great to be back. And I figured you guys mentioned me enough times that the little ticker counter, I have a hit marker, a hit counter on my website. And every time I get mentioned in Podcasters Roundtable, it goes up. And I was thinking maybe we should make this like a Patreon goal, reach $1,000 per month, and we let Daniel out of his cage. But regardless, I'm here anyway.
That's right. We tried to do the Beetlejuice thing, where if we say your name enough times, you show up. And there he was, right there in the little box. That's where he lives, in that little box. We all live just in a little box on the internet. Dave Jackson, welcome back, man.
Yeah, Dave Jackson from the schoolofpodcasting.com. And we're getting the band back together, man. Yes, the chat room is saying, OMG, welcome back, Daniel. So I second that sentiment.
That's awesome that there's anyone in the chat. It's so last minute on this one. So welcome. I'm going to go over there in a minute after I toss to someone else. But let's talk a little bit about, I tweeted this out the other day and I just went back to get the tweet because I remember I had a thought about this. And then it turns out I retweeted my podcast reviews, aka Daniel. And I had a comment about it. So let me go to the original. Daniel's tweet was, the total number of podcasts in Apple Podcast have been unintentionally exaggerated by many. And then I'm going to stop there because we are going to dig in those numbers. Because what I wanted to do is bring up the article first. I also tweeted about that. So unorganized. I got ahead of myself. Let me start here. So Tom Webster, is it Webby 2001? So dated himself when he got on Twitter there. The Edison research guy, as you guys know, from the Share of Ear and all that research for podcasting over many, many years, wrote a quick piece on Medium the other day, and it's called A Pointed Perspective on the Purported Pod Fading Problem. And I just want to read the last quote here, because this is what I tweeted out. And it says, I love the header. It says, the only difference between a TV show and a podcast is who decides to cancel it. Now, that's a great line, because sometimes, maybe we don't always make the best decision to cancel our own show. Sometimes we sort of cancel ourselves without really saying we're canceled. So I certainly have had shows like that. But he says, I think too much is made of pod fading, in quotes, the word pod fading. If your show is not getting traction, maybe it's time to retool it or decide how committed you are to promoting it, or get some reliable third-party feedback on its quality, or stop. Or keep doing it. It's really up to you, but let's retire pod fading. It's derogatory and unappreciative of the myriad of reasons why someone might stop doing a podcast. Let's celebrate the starters. And I thought that was cool. I also, there is all kinds of reasons, and he goes into what I was quoting before about the number of podcasts that are in, again, we're going with Apple, versus the active number of podcasts. And that we are going to get into that because it sort of plays off of that. But he's basically saying how hard a podcast is to do, and he makes some correlation between the number of primetime television shows that were on just in the last 5 or 10 years, and how 15% of those maybe are still active. Maybe, I think it's even worse than that. But the point is that people tune into really good content, and making really good content's a hard thing to do. So did you guys read this?
I did.
Yeah.
What did you think, Dave?
I liked it. The only thing that made me scratch my head is I've never thought of the phrase pod fading as derogatory.
Really?
I've never heard somebody say, "Oh, you dirty pod fader."
But when people say it, though, I do feel like they say, "Oh, that show pod faded," and it does feel negative to me.
Yeah, I can see where it's kind of like, they didn't have the guts to.
It's like a polite quit. Yeah, that person quit. It's like the nice way of saying they quit.
Yeah. But I I thought it was a great point because if you think about it, how many TV shows are like MASH or Seinfeld or Cheers or the one with Dr. McDreamy that I can never remember, Grey's Anatomy? Those are shows that have gone on for like ever. And that's typically not the case. You'll have a show go on that's whatever, 3 or 4 years, and they'll move it to Thursday and then Tuesday and Friday, and then it's gone. How long was Once on the Air, Daniel?
Once Upon a Time was 7 years.
Yeah. So it's I don't think it's the norm that you have these mega hits, but boy, when they get one, they try to squeeze it out as long as they can. But how long did Alex Inc. last? About 7 episodes, and I think it was gone. So I thought it was a great point. What'd you think, Daniel?
I'm the guy that wants to make sure we're using the same definition for things, and that's what I think is different about this. Is when Tom wrote this, I think he's using what is kind of the popular understanding of podfade now, which I think is very different from how what podfade meant when that first term came about. I think a podfade is not something you do. It's actually what happens when you don't do something with your podcast. It's when your podcast fades out of existence. So you never podfade a show, a podcast pod fades. You could say in Soviet Russia, the podcast pod fade you. But it's when we say all of these shows that aren't active are pod faded, I do think that's wrong. Because then you're saying these shows, to me, when I hear pod fade, because of what that means to me, is you're saying these shows faded from existence because their producers, their hosts just didn't put enough energy into it. And I think that is, a little derogatory when there are podcast series out there. And hey, I checked out one of them recently, just exploring the Decca Tapes. It's a really interesting story narrated by certain individuals as part of the story. I think it was 8 episodes, 10 episodes, something like that. I don't think they're going to do another season. But it was really good, really well done storytelling to that. Really nice twist at the end and reveals along the way. And there's no need for that show to continue week after week after week after week or season after season after season. Serial could have been just 1 season, and then maybe it would have still been super respected. So I think we need different terms. Like there's pod faded, there's pod flashed, which is the term I coined for if a show just is like a flash in the pan. It starts and stops before it even has a chance to really get going. Anchor. And there are inactive or retired shows or shows on hiatus or seasonal hiatuses and such. So I think just saying any podcast that's not actively publishing today is pod faded is derogatory.
Yeah, if you think about S-Town's another one, I think that was 7 or 8 episodes. And that was never supposed to be any more episodes. That was just a more or less a short story told over X amount of episodes. And when it was done, it was done. So, yeah, I guess I see the point. Because if we just lump everybody in as a pod fader, then that's not always true.
Yeah, and I think in some cases, especially with the storytelling stuff, is that we see that people have sort of made it clear that there's an end to this, right? So a lot of podcasters start and they don't define its terms. With Daniel, with Once, it's sort of like, we're going to do this until this show exists or it goes off the air pretty much, right, Daniel? I mean, you even got to the point where you didn't want to do it, but you were going to finish it out, right?
Yeah, so, we made a commitment to that show and it just kept going and going and going.
Right. You're lucky it didn't turn in like The Simpsons or something. 20 years later, you might have had to renegotiate your own terms there. But so I think, there's a show that doesn't have a defined sort of end date. It doesn't have seasons, and then sort of just stops producing. Especially a difference if you just stop and don't ever say to the audience, "We're done," right? I mean, there's even a difference there, which you end it. And I think a lot of podcasters always think, "Oh, I'll get back to it," right? And I think, so would you call that pod faded, Daniel, where someone didn't really sort of leave the audience with a finality and say, "We're done," it just kind of went away?
Yeah, if it faded from existence, either by
but didn't
slowly
exist. I mean,
or
if it's still there, right? I mean, it's still in the catalog, which we're going to talk about. But
yeah,
new episodes aren't showing up, and no one ever said this is over. Because even the podcaster believes, I'll get back to it.
Yeah, if you're leaving your audience hanging like that with no notice of saying, I will be back, I'm not sure when, or just the last episode is join me again next week, and there is no episode next week. I think that's something like a pod fade.
Yeah.
My favorite, and this is such a great example of when you probably should just quit, is I'd been doing a show for musicians for about 11 years. And I normally don't split up interviews, but it was really long. And we talked about 2 separate subjects. And I put out part 1 of the interview, and I'll be like, well, play part 2 next week. And I never did. And here's the great part about it. Nobody asked about it. That's when you know, okay, I lost my audience long before. I was really spotty with putting out consistent data and content. And I was kind of I'd lost my passion for it. And I put out part 1 and nobody asked for part 2. That was the best.
Your audience faded too.
Yeah, that was it. That was audience fade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He even uses the words telefade in here. We're going to need a pocketbook to navigate the freaking world of podcasting here. So take notes. Well, he starts his article basing it on numbers that he saw for total number of historical podcasts, meaning how many podcasts exist ever, I guess, or have been created and put into sort of the Apple podcast directory. And he says approximately 760,000. He's getting those numbers from Blueberry, which we only need to be somewhere in the ballpark. It's not that important in this case. And then he says a percentage of those were updated in the last year. Oh, percentage of those that were updated in the last year, meaning they got a new episode, was 39%. Something like that. But Daniel, you have slightly different numbers. And then, so that's what that tweet, when I started off reading that first tweet, that's what it was about. You said the total number of podcasts and Apple Podcasts have been unintentionally exaggerated by many. As of this afternoon, this was back, June 14th, so not that long ago. You said there are 705.8 thousand podcasts in Apple Podcast and 284.3 thousand, 40% have published an episode within the last 90 days. And then you said more data coming soon. So, in the ballpark, there's somewhere around 700,000 podcasts. I guess that's in the library, Daniel? The Apple Podcast?
Yeah. So what I've been doing, and where that bigger number that you may hear some people say 750, 760, anything like that, that's coming from probably tracking how many have ever been added as of when they started looking. But what I did is I started filtering out all the shows that have been removed from Apple Podcasts. And since I started tracking in December 2018, 47,500 podcasts have been removed from Apple Podcasts, removed for various reasons, and we'll probably get into those. But so that number of 710 now is about where it is. That is shows that you can actively find right now in Apple Podcasts and subscribe to.
Right. And so my retweet of that, and then with comment, I said, so starting a podcast there's lots in the catalog, which means it can be hard to break through. But given how many podcasts stop production, podfade maybe, it means if you persist, you can compete. And I said, sort of stick with it, sort of a positive message there. But because if you start a new podcast, essentially, it doesn't matter. I've often said to people, hey, you want to start a podcast in X niche, whatever it is. And I said, go look in Apple and see, does it exist? How many are there? And don't get discouraged by the fact that you find 7 in your category. How many of those are producing episodes? Are they still active? And it might be, 2, maybe 3 of them of the 7 that you find. So, when you first get in, it might be harder to surface. But if you are the active podcast, if you're one of 2 active podcasts in that niche, then over time, that other person who's listening to that same niche and found that historical podcast has got 30 episodes, they're going to probably migrate towards you because they're going to run out of stuff. So you can, I think, float to the top of your niche if you stick with it. But, so there's it's funny because it feels like there's a lot, but there really still isn't. And we know this number compared to blogs is just like a fraction. So you're active podcast. And how are you defining active podcast?
This is where, and this is why the numbers I have are so different from Blueberry's numbers for active, is because, at least for this data, I defined active as any podcast that has published an episode in the last 90 days, even if that's only one episode and they just started and maybe 90 days ago they published one episode and haven't published anything since. That is counted in my numbers. Now I can filter that down more. but that's how I'm, at least for now, defining active, is published an episode within 90 days.
Yeah, and I think that's, and that's kind of what I would say you're actually, if you want to say, competing against, right? To be found is this sort of active podcast number. So the library is deep. It's still not that deep. But the active podcast is sort of who else is producing podcasts. And then I would say even in your own niche, it's not a lot. And again, it's hard. It's hard to do regular content, right?
And here's an even smaller number for you. How many podcasts have published an episode within the last 7 days?
Oh my gosh.
48.4 thousand. That's 6.8% of the catalog.
I would have to say, like, I'd be more curious about 2 weeks, because that 7 day depends on what 7 days. I don't know. Maybe the last like 2 weeks gives everyone a chance to publish one episode within a week. I mean, if the 7 days is, yeah, I guess. I mean, like if you're 8 days, I don't know. What about, how fast can you punch up those numbers?
Right now,
He's punching as he.
Given the Roundtable is a bi-weekly,
Yeah, I'm gonna say.
prefer,
7 seconds.
which I actually think is an interesting, what I've seen between, while Daniel's looking that up, I think he already has it, but what I've seen between shows that I do that are bi-weekly and weekly, I'm seeing numbers that are telling me that bi-weekly gives people, so that's once every 2 weeks, fortnightly, as we say here in the header of the Roundtable. Fortnight. Is it? Are we getting indexed for? No one's watching. None of the kids are watching. If they
Seth Godin should really be listening to this, because we're awesome, like Pat Flynn and John Lee Dumas. Now we'll get indexed for those words.
This is and since Google is now indexing the podcast via transcription, we just hacked the whole system. We're going straight to number one.
Especially if we wanted to make $1 million in 6 weeks.
Oh, how could I make $1 million in 6 weeks, Dave?
With smart passive income, that's how. Okay, number of podcasts that have published an episode within the last 2 weeks, fortnight, 12,000. No, I'm sorry, wrong number. 143.2 thousand, 20.1%.
That's so you went just, instead of 7 days, you went 14, and you like tripled the number. Right?
Yeah.
It was 40,000 for so I think that's a good number of like who's really active. And so, as I was saying, shows that are published, at least in my very small sample, anecdotally, I'm seeing that a show that goes every week ultimately gets more listens because they're every week. But that their per episode number is lower after, say, like 4 weeks, right? So the bi-weekly show actually picks up, I would say, in some of the cases I'm looking at, a couple thousand more. So do you guys think that, and it's consistent, do you think, my theory is that it gives people, what are the numbers? Speaking of Edison, I think in Sherevy or one of the studies, they show that once people start listening to podcasts, once they find podcasts, they really start to exchange their audio listening time or their listening time to podcasts. So maybe they shove out more radio, maybe they shove out audiobooks, and they start to listen to even more podcasts. And so I think that people who listen to podcasts regularly have a lot of stuff to listen to, and that having an episode every 2 weeks gives them more time to get to your episode. Whereas I think people, if you publish an episode and then you publish another episode and that person has not even gotten to the one that was, published before the most recent one, they'll skip it. I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm seeing. I don't think being bi-weekly is affecting the audience. I think it's actually very interesting. In some cases, I think it gives people more chance to consume it. And it depends on the content, right? If you have a topical-based show, you're more likely to skip because you want, I mean, not topical, but like time-related, time-sensitive show. Have you guys seen anything like that?
Well, when the TV show Once Upon a Time in its first and second season had a pretty unpredictable schedule at times, especially early in the calendar year, where they would be on for 2 weeks, off for a week, on for 3 weeks, off for 2 weeks, stuff like that. And it was really weird, and it confused the audience, and their viewership declined for a big reason because of that. So people would sit down to their TVs to watch, and there's no episode. And then by the next week, maybe they forgot, maybe they thought, oh, the show's probably canceled, or it wasn't there last week. But a podcast is different because of the subscription. So if someone subscribes to a podcast and there's not an episode there, they might not necessarily notice, depending on how loyal of a fan they are. But when you do publish an episode, as long as they haven't unsubscribed, they'll get that next episode. So I think the more content you put out, I think the better it is and easier it is to build an audience, the more consistent that schedule is. And I think weekly is easy for an audience to get used to, as well as a podcaster, but you do what you have to do, and people can adapt to that, I think.
Yeah, in your case with the TV show, it's definitely, I mean, it's like a podcast telling you we're going to be here every week, and then you expect the TV show to be there like once the season starts. So especially a major brand like that, it's very weird for it to sort of not be there. An erratic schedule on a TV show would be very disruptive. On a podcast, ideally, but like you said, the subscription thing at least delivers it when it is there. And I still recommend general recommendations. Once a week is sort of that prime spot. But having said that, for so long, it's interesting what I see in the numbers being every 2 weeks. Anything beyond that, I think, is really just almost a special audio on the web type thing. Like, it hardly seems like a podcast, but that's like a personal feeling. Of course, if you put one episode down a feed once a year, technically you have a podcast, right?
I'm thinking of an illustration here. We could call it the law of pod blobbing returns or something like that. Imagine a blob. Like, there are certain toys like this that, you can squeeze and the blob stuff moves around inside it. But something like a TV show, high production value, large audience, short run series. So its blob shape is very tall, very, rise and fall of the TV show. When the show goes off the air, the audience pretty much goes with it, and there's that dramatic decline. A podcast, though, you kind of smoosh that blob down and to one end, and that's more the, I think, growth pattern of most podcasts, where they're publishing consistently over a longer amount of time than a TV show does. I mean, even just in a yearly schedule, a TV show is on usually for 6 months. A podcast might go for the full 52 weeks of the year. You push that blob down and you have a more gradual growth. And then if your schedule is more infrequent than weekly, you're kind of stretching that blob out. I think I want to develop this, the law of diminishing pod blobbing returns on fire.
I'm going to say, I just add that to your pod dash whatever word notebook.
I think podblobbingreturns.com is available.
I'm sure. Well, it was until you said it out loud, and then Dave got
right. I'm on it right now. Well, you mentioned something, though, that I always forget. Like, right now, I have probably over 100 episodes waiting for me to listen to, and I am not by any means a regular podcast listener. What does Edison say? It's like 5 to 7, and we still don't know if that's episodes.
No, we know. This is my pet peeve here. The way the Edison says is they say 7 podcasts. What is it, a week or something like that?
Yeah.
And I asked Tom at a meeting specifically. I went up afterwards and I said, does this mean 7 podcasts, meaning shows, or episodes? And it's episodes. So, and why they don't define that, it drives me crazy. So what it means is people listen. It could be 3 episodes of the School of Podcasting and 4 Audacity to Podcast. It's 7 episodes.
Right. So that's where, if you aren't consistent in your schedule, and every Thursday I listen to Ray, and all of a sudden it's Thursday and there's no Ray, and I got to drive to work, I'm like, oh, I got to find something because I can't listen to the radio. That's where I think it might be a little bit a more impact on your listener than for me. I mean, I listened to James Cridlin today, and it was like from 4 days ago. I'm so far behind on my news. So I think that's a difference too. It depends on who your audience is and how many podcasts they listen to, if pod fading is going to be that impactful on your audience.
I feel like, go ahead, Daniel.
I wish we could know the why behind that answer. To when people say, I listen to this many, quote, podcasts, whether that's episodes or separate shows, but this many podcasts per week, why? Is it because that's just the number of podcasts that they like? Is that's the number of podcasts they have time for? Is that simply the number of podcasts they subscribed to 5 years ago and they haven't thought to look for anything since then?
Yeah. And as you're talking, I would be curious to know that. And I also think that everyone has a lot of podcasts, but I feel like they always have, most people have one or two that they are in that spot where they get in their car, it's Thursday, they're looking forward to it, and it's not there, and they're like, oh man, that hurts, right? Most of the time, the beauty of podcast and finding other shows is that you do have something usually in your app to go to. But for me, there is one podcast that I will have that feeling. I don't want to have to go to something else. I want that show. Right. So if you are that person's that show, it's more devastating. And if you're building it at some point, what do you have, 500 listeners, 1,000, 15,000? That's probably the number. If you're seeing that consistently, downloads per, after 4 weeks from release, that's your base of people who really hope that you show up when you say you show up. Right. So it is interesting that the choice we have and like having to pivot. I don't like to have to pivot, but I got plenty to go to. And Mad Minister in the chat says the bell is our friend, which he's commenting back on. I said I was surprised there's anyone here. So if you're watching live, yes, hit that little bell. And I don't ever seems to work for me, but the notifications on YouTube, hit that so it'll tell you when we're live. And if you're listening to the audio only, well, hopefully you're subscribed. But you can also go to youtube.com/podcastersroundtable. Check us out there once in a while. And
Rob Greenlee in the chat mentioned something that I think,
nice.
Yeah, he said other shows that are monthly episodes are huge too. Sure, weekly is a great sweet spot. Seems like less frequent episodes tend to grow community slower. I think we need another law of something here for this, but there's a thing, like I see it right now where, yes, because of my life right now, the Audacity to Podcast published one episode in 2018. And I'm about to actually publish another episode in 2019, maybe more than one episode in 2019. It might even be available by the time you're hearing this. But so when I look at my stats, I see that one episode, that one last episode that I published in 2018 has a huge number of downloads to it. Now, I'm looking at that, not thinking, wow, my audience has really grown. I'm looking at it thinking, all right, how many downloads is my next episode going to get? Because when there's a limited number of episodes, or when there are longer gaps between episodes, it gives people a lot more time to get those episodes. Like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, where he publishes his audiobook, aka also known as a podcast episode, whenever he gets around to it. And those episodes are highly praised. They're really good. And there's a lot of time there for people to subscribe, download that latest episode. So I don't think it's necessarily that infrequent episodes, you can say, have a bigger audience. I think it's just they get more downloads.
Well, and in your case, that's the one people are landing on when they find your show. It's the one at the top, right? And Rob said he's seen faster audience growth with 2 episodes a week too. He said it depends on the content and the community, of course. It's always it depends, right?
I've seen that though. I had somebody this week that contacted me and said, "Hey, our numbers are way down. What's going on?" And I looked, and they would put out like 2 episodes, and then they'd skip like 3 months. Then they'd put out another 2 episodes, and then they kind of went, "Okay, we're doing this for real." And they'd put out episodes like once a week. And I said, the reason your numbers are smaller is because your other ones had 3 months of people downloading that episode. So to kind of go back with what Daniel says, when you take a break, or if there's more time in between, if somebody subscribes to your show, most apps will download your latest episode. So you're going to get more downloads from that.
And I think that sort of 4-week number is important, right? So Daniel's talking about how many downloads will my next episode get. So looking at how many downloads you get 4 weeks from the date of publish gives you a better idea of what your next episode is probably going to perform in that same time frame. Because like again, having that one that sits there all the time is going to get more downloads. It's not going to give you an indication of what the next is. But that number, this is what number we've kind of always used to sort of guesstimate the subscriber base. If you see that after 4 weeks from publish, average that out over like 3-4 months, you get some idea that you can probably count on maybe that number's 1,000. You can count on 1,000 people downloading within 4 weeks the next episode. So you have some idea, right?
I think it depends on how you approach the content for your show as well, because you can look at other types of traditional media that are out there. Movies, they might make a few movies in a series and they're done. They might make a one-off movie and they're done. Just that one movie. TV shows, maybe a few seasons and they're done. Books, sometimes it's one book, sometimes it's a series of books and they're done. But a magazine, that's month after month after month or quarter after quarter, however often that is. Same thing with newspapers. Now, magazines and newspapers, I know, are kind of dying mediums right now, but a podcast could be like that TV show or movie or book where it's something that you put a lot of hard work into it. You make some great material that's timeless, that people will enjoy for years to come, and you're done. And or your podcast could be like the magazine, which I think our podcasts are like that, where we've always got something to say about our industry. And so we're publishing more like a magazine format, constantly bringing out new information, new coverage, new ideas, new approaches.
Is the way that you guys think of seasons, has that changed at all? Are we seeing the rise of seasons? And obviously it's anecdotal. I don't have data on this, but as I think about pod fading, as I go through struggling with pod fading of my own shows, as this show is not always consistent, the podcast studio certainly sort of sits there, gets a show whenever. And I've also worked on some other shows that do seasons. And is it a more sane way to work? Like, I don't miss an episode ever, I'm here every week, is a bit insane on some level. It's a bit not insane, but that's a lot of pressure to put on yourself, especially if it's not your job. And I think it is put on yourself. I think a lot of podcasters do that to themselves. And we talked about burnout on one of these rounds. But seasons, what do you guys think of? I mean, I kind of like the idea of producing 8 episodes, calling it a season, in that the audience knows, right? There's an expectation there. Okay, they know it's break time. It's summer. We don't podcast in the summer. We'll be back with another season. And I don't know how that really hurts if you're telling people, yeah, we do seasons. I don't know. What do you guys think about seasons? Has it changed? Has your opinion on seasons changed? Do you have an opinion on seasons?
For me, I think you hit the nail on the head. You have to communicate with your audience what's going on. Is there a part? Because I am that guy that doesn't want to miss every Monday, come hell or high water. If I get hit by a deer, I'm still putting out a podcast. And I don't know why that is. I think at this point, just because it's such a long streak.
Yeah.
But there is, I have heard comments kind of like, well, if you do seasons, come on, buckle up and get in there and do it every week or whatever it is. But I think in the long run, you have to take care of you. And I'm actually thinking about, I do a show called the Podcast Rodeo Show, and that's 3 days a week. Now, it's a really short show, but I'm actually thinking of going to my audience and going, I'm going to do 3 weeks on, 1 week off. Because it's a lot of shows to do. And if it starts to burn you out, then something's got to give. So I don't know. So I'm not really, the only thing I worry about is I really think I would have loved to seen what Serial would have done if they had taken like a 2-week break. They took a long break between 1 and 2.
What
are your thoughts, Daniel?
Yeah, like a year doesn't work.
Yeah. Daniel, what are your thoughts on seasons?
It depends on the show. And that's the thing, that since podcasting first came out, there's a lot more creativity in the space of how we can use this medium. I mean, look how long it took Apple to come out with new categories for Apple Podcasts. And we didn't need a true crime category 10 years ago. Well, now we do, because there's stinking so many true crime podcasts out there. And all of these other categories, as the industry has changed over the years. So I think seasonal approaches can fit some shows, maybe not others. And some ways that I've seen it done really well, like a long-running podcast. I'm not sure if it's still running because I'm no longer in this industry, but the BOAG World web design podcast did seasons that did follow somewhat of a seasonal schedule, but also followed seasonal topics. And I thought their approach to seasons was really clever, because they could reapproach the same topic, but from a different perspective. Like one season was the tools season. So every episode, they were talking about certain tools for web design. One season was the top 10 season. So every episode was a top 10 of something for web designers. One season was talking with clients to learn about the web design process. So every episode was that. And I think they did take some breaks between the seasons. You don't have to take a break between seasons. Seasons could be topical, they could be schedule based. I think it really goes to what fits you, what fits your content, what fits your audience. If you do a news show, current events kind of show, there might not be seasons for your content, and your audience is going to miss you. Even if your content is seasonal, like you do a TV show fan podcast, your audience might be desperate for content when the TV show is off the air and they want to hear from you, but it still needs to be good content.
Dave pulled the same comment out of the chat and you put it in the private chat here that I also was going to mention. So what was that?
Yeah, Patrick Keller says, as a listener, seasons annoy me. The shows that do seasons tend to have no rhyme or reason for why or when. And I think that, again, goes back to communicating with your audience. If you say, hey, we're going to return in 2 weeks because I said so. I don't know about you growing up, because I said so that never went over well with me. But if somebody says, hey, I'm going to take 2 weeks off because I don't know, I got whatever the reason is. I think if you give any reason, period, your audience is your friends. And unless it's something like, because I don't feel like it, which again is a legitimate reason, but I don't know that anybody's going to go, well, I'm not going to listen to him anymore. Why? Well, his grandma died, so forget it. He can't make an episode, when Granny died. I'm like, no, I think if anybody said anything, they'll be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, he's got to take care of some stuff, and we'll see him when he gets back. So I think it all comes back to communication.
Yeah, and I think that, what he's saying there too, like an interview show that just does seasons, like what you just, season 2 is just interviews with the same people. Like, I don't understand why
Asking
there's
the
a
same
season
questions.
here. Right. So I think if you define the reason for the season being, this is how I produce, like I'm going to do intensive production for the next 8 weeks, and then I'm taking 4 weeks off or whatever it is. I do think defining it also makes me wonder, and it is related to the content. How much do we produce for the sort of the current listener and then just sort of the catalog? I mean, honestly, I've kind of always looked at the Podcaster Studio as building a catalog. So if a new podcaster found it, they could learn how to podcast. And it didn't really matter that they found it today or they find it a year or 2 years from now. It was more important to me to have a body of work that someone could go through and do the thing I want them to do, which is start a podcast. And so I'm not very interested in keeping up with news per se. I'm interested in keeping up with stuff that would change how, like best practice, maybe how you start a podcast. But, seasons, like a story like Serial is still being, or Finding Richard Simmons, I think is what it was called, which I love. You can pick that up anytime. Now it will start to get old. Serial, the case, will become less relevant over the years, although things are still going on. But in cases like that, you're really producing for, it's almost like a book. Like anyone could pick it up, sort of start it and put it down and go on to the next thing. So often it just made me think about producing for sort of the weekly listener and then sort of the someone who's going to come in and get something from it. Especially as I think about how Google Podcasts is, in theory, going to work, where it's going to surface content for things people are searching for. If that thing is your podcast, then it might serve it up to them to get, well, we talked about with Evo, not necessarily get an answer. That probably won't surface, but, because they search for a topic. And so they might not be there weekly. You might be, my YouTube channel runs on search. I mean, it doesn't mean when I publish a video, I'm going to get the 60,000 subs that they're not going to watch. It runs on search. So I'm curious how podcasts might pivot to running on search, and how might that play into our production? I don't know. Any spot? I literally just thought about that.
Mike Rowe had a great example. He does the Way I Heard It podcast, and he got a book deal because of his podcast. And he basically said, I forget how many months he's taking off. He goes, because I need to go write this book. And he goes, even though some of it's based on the podcast, he has to write some new stuff. And he goes, and if I try to write the book and do the podcast, I will die. And he's like, so I'm just going to take some time off. I'll be back. I think he said in August, and I'll have new episodes. I'm recording them now, and some other things going on. And we at that point, I was like, oh, cool. And then he even said, I'll let you know when the book comes out, because if you can, he started kind of prime the pump. It's like, hey, when it comes out, everybody go buy the book. And I thought that was just a great example of like, okay, here's how you take a break. Here's, I'm taking a break, and here's why, and here's when I'm coming back, if you know when that is. So
There was a really interesting psychology study done several years ago. Not quite sure what to look up for it, but the basics of it, I'm sorry, I can't quote the actual numbers, but the basics were what kind of effect does giving a reason have on people? So they used examples of someone cutting in line to make some copies at a copy store. Boy, this sounds so dated already. So they said when someone would just simply ask, hey, can I cut in line? They were very unlikely to be allowed to cut in line. But if someone asked, can I cut in line? I'm in a hurry, or my kid's in the car, or whatever, there was a very high percentage that they'd be allowed to cut in line. But even if they simply said, hey, can I cut in line? I need to make some copies, which everyone else is in the line to make copies. But simply giving a reason significantly jumped up the percentage almost to the same level of, I've got this emergency or this urgent circumstance, just simply giving that reason. So I think when you hear people like Mike Rowe or anyone else say, I'm going to take a break from the podcast because of this, because I need some time for my personal life, or because someone's sick, or because I'm working on this other project, simply giving a reason, as long as it's truthful. Eric, forgot his name, Eric K. Johnson.
Okay, John.
He says, always tell the truth. That's a big thing too. So just simply giving that reason, I think your audience will sympathize a lot more with that, and in a way kind of maybe feel part of it.
Yeah, it seems so obvious, but we don't always do it, right? It does seem obvious. You're like, yeah, it makes total sense. But this is how you hack humans. Like, social engineering, but really giving people a reason. Yeah, I mean, it goes back, Dave, like Dave said, communicate with your audience. That's very important. And I obviously the ideal is you want this. We're here every 2 weeks. You can count on it. And I would say if you're for the most part consistent with that, you're fine. I don't give enough reasons. I just say, life is crazy. And, this show, I'm going to lean on the fact that the people who consume the show are also podcasters, so they get it. Stuff is hard, man. But, life is crazy. But yeah, I think that's, again, communicate with your audience. Reasons can really change, I think, how that communication goes, or lack of communication. So I was also with this article and then talking about the number of podcasts in Apple Podcasts. And Daniel, you already led us into this about Apple getting rid of podcasts. So you've been kind of tracking this lately, right? What have you been seeing?
Yeah, I haven't dug into yet why. But yeah, since December 2018, it's June 2019 now, 47,500 podcasts have been removed from Apple Podcasts.
Do you know how many have been added?
Yes, in that same amount of time.
Yeah.
100 and something thousand.
Which
so
is,
the number was 609,000 in early December or November 2018. And that was before these 47,500 have been removed. So about 160,000, rough guess off the top of my head, podcasts have been added since then. So around 150,000 this year. And some of those that have been added have also been removed.
Right. So we hear this all the time. People get frustrated. We talk about being found, or that I talked about. There are 7 shows in your niche, and there's one that has been not active for 6 years, but you can never climb above it. You don't rank. It always comes up first, right? And people wonder why this is. They go crazy because they're active and that show is not, even though basically that has to do with the fact that still more people are subscribing or consuming that podcast. It's really good, right? It's enough to drive people, or it's got this long tail effect of, maybe some of that goes to algorithm and the fact that it was there longer. helps, right? But so some people they just want purge. They just want the purge. They want people whose shows are not active. I want them gone. But can we speculate on some ideas why Apple is pulling out these? What do we think makes Apple take a podcast out? Because it's not just the fact that you're not active. That's not enough. And I don't think you'd want that, honestly.
Well, there are still people keyword stuffing.
Mhm.
And it's and so I have seen that where somebody be like, hey, I'm trying to relist my show in Apple and I'm hitting a snag on something, and I'll be like, okay, well, hold on a second. And then you'll go in and you'll see, well, I can see why you got pulled, because there's just keywords all over the place and their author field has all sorts of stuff in it that it shouldn't have. And I'm like, okay, well, first things first, you need to clean this up. So that's still going on. I think we don't hear about it as much because I think the people in the past that were getting pulled were in like the top 200. So it was a little, maybe more of a, if somebody said, hey, I got pulled and you're a top 200 person, in theory, you're going to have a bigger audience than somebody who's not in the top 200 that says, hey, I got pulled. So I think that's part of it. Daniel, do you know any other reasons why?
Yeah, so those that you just mentioned, I would say those were kicked out because they were violating the terms in some reason. I think the other really big reason podcasts are removed are for technical reasons. Their feed is broken, their episodes don't download. I've seen that happen to some clients where they break something in their feed, they don't realize it, and 2 weeks later they're asking, why is my podcast no longer an Apple Podcast? And it's because their feed is broken, or no episodes download, or something like that. So for technical reasons, and I've definitely seen that as I recently
podcast, Produce Picker. It's blip.tv where I was host. They went away, and at some point I didn't even think about it because I was also done with the show, and then only realized that probably like a Podcast Connect, when that came out, I was like, oh, it shows you it's like deleted. I'm like, oh, well, of course the feed doesn't work, right? That you can't get these files, and there is essentially, I think there was still a feed, but there's no files. So that's a reason I got removed. I didn't even know it.
Even just in the data I've been working with recently, the last few days, I see, looks like maybe 25,000 feeds that I couldn't pull data from. And that could be for various reasons. It could be a bug in my code. I know there are some bugs, but I did see a lot of instances where the feed was invalid. Either the feed was broken, or it had invalid tags, or something technically wrong with it. I think that's the biggest reason
Number one reason
Apple removes something. But even a couple of years ago at one of the WWDC conferences, James Boggs, the head over Apple Podcasts, said that they are constantly cleaning up their directory to remove podcasts that are having technical problems or that break the rules. And I think that's the main two reasons podcasts are removed: technical problems or break the rules. No episodes. I don't think Apple is going to remove anything just because it hasn't published an episode, as long as the feed works.
Yeah, and that's the thing and that's really, if you think about it, that's the intent of the podcaster. If they're keeping the feed alive, so in this case, if they're paying Libsyn to host their files and keep the feed alive, like the whole point was, I mean, think about Finding Richard Simmons. Is that what it's called? Anyways.
Missing Richard Simmons, I think.
It's not right. It keeps coming to my mouth. It's not right. It's good. I enjoyed it. But in that case, like, no more episodes are coming down. But he obviously, the author, the podcaster, he wants it there. It's there to live. Like I said, sort of be consumed when anyone finds it, almost in the way of a book. So certainly shows that are not producing active episodes does not mean they should be removed. And I think people might want more weight to go towards active podcast. And I say weight, the algorithm, whatever guides iTunes moving up down the charts, which honestly, who cares? But people do care. It's not gonna make a difference, whatever. What do you guys think? Do you think that there should be some more? I don't know. I mean, I even have a hard time asking because it's like, I don't really care about charts, so to speak. And only because I say that because it doesn't make a difference.
I think Apple is getting really big into machine learning.
Yeah.
And I think they're pointing some of those algorithms toward podcasts. And maybe that's why some podcasts have been removed more recently. Like in the chat room just now, Patrick Keller asks, are there still podcasts without artwork? Well, one of the things in Apple's requirements is they say, don't have placeholder text or cover art or no placeholder information in your show. So maybe their machine learning algorithms are looking for all of those podcasts that still have the default PodPress logo or something like that, some default logo, some default title or default text, and maybe they're removing those. They're not technically broken, but they're not doing things properly. I think as far as where else they'll go with that machine learning is taking some of this other data they're getting on how much episodes are consumed. YouTube has been doing this for years, where, and this is one of the big reasons I'm against fake video on YouTube. If a video has tens of thousands of views, but those views only stick around for 30 seconds and then leave, YouTube is going to see this video, for some reason, is turning people away. So this isn't a very good video. I think Apple may, this is only a theory, or hypothesis maybe even, Apple may start implementing algorithms like that as well, which would be really cool.
Stat. I think they should. They have the retention stat,
Yeah.
right? So, and I think, YouTube has figured this out. YouTube had to switch to that model because things were gamed and be like, this video got 1 million views. It clearly should be put in front of people. But then they found out, okay, obviously there are ways to game that, but it's a lot harder to game the fact that, 100,000 people watched 75% of the video, right? Of course there are ways, but retention is a great indicator for how are people receiving the content, right? It's one thing to get people to click on it, which is hard enough as it is, but then to keep them is a big deal. And so, yeah, I think that, are you saying that you would like to see that factored into how podcasts are ranked inside of Apple, sort of surfaced in even search?
Yeah, because just for the pure fact that it's not something that can be gamed very easily. It's not simply clicking a button. But yeah, in search, in charts, in features, and maybe Apple is even already using that for what they decide to really feature. They see, wow, this episode is getting listened to a lot. It's a 6-hour long episode and people are listening to every single minute of it. Let's feature this podcast. So yeah, I think they're going to use that, or are maybe already. I mean, and I would like to see that.
We do get the stat. Like, it's almost like a foreshadowing, right? It's like, what is Apple showing you that they're collecting? And we've gotten this retention stat for now over a year. So it almost, the same way with YouTube. Like, YouTube will give you the information that they're also looking at because they want you to produce better stuff. And so, yeah, it does seem logical to me that they would go in that direction. Now, when I said it doesn't matter, do you think it would matter? So, okay, good. They're doing something that is surfacing relevant content that people like. Does that have do you think that has any kind of impact on someone's show, or it's just, okay, cool, you got the search better?
It depends on how they build the algorithm. Because if it's measuring audience size, I think that's not always a good thing, because then it's the independent people who get left out,
right?
Who may have really good quality content.
Well, that's why I think retention is big there, because these shows that are featured, you might have an independent show that's getting way better retention, even in its own, and even in the same niche. But I'm asking, do people even search this way? Does it matter?
The Jacobs Media had a thing, and they said 70% of people are basically finding podcasts through word of mouth.
Right. Which is oftentimes another podcast they're listening to, I would say.
Right.
Word of mouth sounds weird. It sounds like my neighbor came over and was like, dude, open the door. You got to hear this podcast.
Hey, International Podcast Day is coming up.
That's right.
Knock on your neighbor's doors.
Knock on doors. We're going canvassing, people.
Yeah. But that could be, I mean, you're right. Word of mouth could be, I heard it on another podcast.
So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, obviously, it's kind of like the IAB. Like, people harp and they talk about, and they're just constantly trying to figure out what a download is so they can deliver these numbers so we can get big brands like Ford and Lay's chips. And I don't care. Most people don't care. These are not brand deals that most people want. These are pennies on the dollar. It's useless. We spend a lot of energy talking about this, but it's not usually the way that most podcasters are even going to persist or even deal with. It is kind of a 1%er type game. Yet it's still important, I think, to figure out how to get the most accurate analytics. And I think in the same way, we want search to work the best it can, You know, and Google's obviously working on their own way to sort of surface podcast in search. And so maybe if we tweak on search, even though that's where the question becomes weird, because it's like, well, if people aren't searching this way, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I think we want the best we can get, but if people are not using the system, how much does it matter? It's like reaching nirvana. You can't get there, but you don't stop trying.
It's building a foundation for what people may do later. Like right now, we say, yeah, people don't search for podcasts very much, but people do get on Netflix and search for something to watch. They channel surf. I did it just recently. But unless they know something they want to watch, or their show that they like is there with Netflix new episodes.
Also super powered by word of mouth, though. Like everyone's like, have you seen this show? You have to watch Handmaid's Tale. You know what I mean? Like super powered by word of mouth.
Oh yeah. I think later, as people get more and more accustomed to podcast consumption, they may want to go find something new, or they may be thinking of, oh, this is a really good podcast. This whole new world of podcasts has opened up to me. I'm interested in such and such. I want to find a podcast about that. I think that's where the foundation that's being laid still will really help later in the future for people to find the right podcast for them.
And I think this actually applied to me recently, because for the first time that I could recall, I was in Apple Podcasts searching for just trying to find a podcast. And why was that? Because I let my daughter come and go to sleep in my office, and I was like, look, you know, she wants to watch her show or whatever. And I was like, no, watching time's over. I said, but you can listen to a podcast. If you close your eyes, I'll play a podcast. And I was like, I don't necessarily have. I wanted to find something new, like not just the one she listens to. So I just went to kids and I started searching. And let me tell you, half of the stuff I was like, this is not at all what I'm looking for. And I think I ended up on a Gimlet show, and it was all artwork based. Like they just nailed the artwork. And that's how I was searching. I was like, what looks interesting? So in this case, it was one of the few times where I did go to search. And, you know, I'm sure that show came up within the first, 100 or whatever the list shows you. This was on Apple TV at the time. So I think it can be category dependent too. I mean, in that case, it was just like, I'm not a kid, but I need something for my kid, right? So I'm just like, let me just search the category and see what looks interesting. Almost like YouTube, I mean, thumbnail driven. So I thought it was really interesting, because I was like kind of laughing as I sat there searching, going, this is the way I say the people never search this way. Here I am, like trying to find a podcast.
I just did that too, because I ran out of podcasts that make me laugh. I wanted a podcast to make me laugh. So in Overcast, I went looking in the comedy section, and this may be the beginning of the end, folks. I found an NPR podcast, and I actually, I liked it.
Welcome to Welcome to the enlightened.
But it wasn't the traditional way we think of NPR podcasts. It was Wait, Don't Tell Me, which is a game show, and it's very entertaining. And that's why I liked it, and subscribed and downloaded all the back episodes that were available.
There you go. That's what happened.
I can't believe you ran out of podcasts. That's maybe that is the actual shocking part of your sentence, not that you like video.
In that playlist in Overcast, I ran out of podcasts.
Yes, comedies. But I mean, it was there was niche specific again, right? So, you know, with this whole reshuffling of the categories, do you think, as I said, I was kids and family that I was looking in, and I'm looking for sort of a storytelling podcast that's focused at kids, but I'm getting a lot of podcasts that are for parents, right? So I'm like, this is not what I wanted. So in that case, I want just podcasts that are for kids. So do you think that what do you guys think of the reshuffling of the categories? If you guys don't know, if you're listening to this or watching this, Apple they've gotten rid of some subcategories, maybe even a couple primary, I'm not sure, and added some others. So if like our category for this show would be podcasting, it's gone. It was never useful, because all of you who have a podcast also thought you were in the podcasting category. So it made us irrelevant. So, but we're going to be in those cases, if they're getting rid of your subcat, Subcat. Oh, that's a good logo for that. I just want to be a subcat. It's any talented illustrators, please draw me a subcat. We're just gonna be bumped up to tech, I think, and we can switch it if we want. But what do you guys think of the reshuffling, the recreating, the getting rid of categories?
Well, for me, you never take things away from your customer. So I know the people in K through 12 are like, "What do you mean you're taking away K through 12?" And
But
we're sitting here.
It could
But
be. I mean,
yeah, I think it's a great start. It is one of those things where, because I heard Todd talking about this, like they don't have a LGBT XKM whatever that is category, and the guy from Apple was like, well, if we do that, then we have to have male and female and African American. And I'm like, well, yeah, you could. And I'm like, is that such a bad thing, really, to have too many? I mean, is it bad to have too many categories? I don't know. And it kind of goes back to, like you said, how many people actually surf that way? I don't know. Daniel, what are your thoughts on the categories?
I think they're generally good. Now, some things like the K through 12, I don't think that's completely gone. I think it's simply renamed. I have yet to see how the ID numbers behind these categories change. So, like, yes, education K through 12 is gone, but there's now kids and family education for kids. That might be the same thing. Maybe that's just moved over. I think these categories are pretty well thought out. In general, one problem with the categories is when a single subcategory could appear under multiple top level categories. For example, news. There's news. Let's do fiction. So under fiction, there's comedy fiction, drama, and science fiction. Under comedy, there's comedy, interviews, improv, and stand-up. So if you want comedy fiction, are you going to go to comedy first or are you going to go to fiction first? If you go to fiction first, you'll find comedy fiction. But if you go to comedy first, you won't find comedy fiction under there. So I wish that they would have these tied together a little bit more. And I did send this feedback to them so that someone can end up in the same place through multiple routes as comedy fiction, music news, TV, movie news. Different things like that can go under multiple categories. As far as like what's missing, I think that for one thing, they probably looked a lot at what's currently being used, where are shows fitting, and how important is it to have a specific category for a kind of show, and do people really expect to find something like that?
And one of the breakdowns there is podcasters have to choose where to put themselves, right? So like where you think you belong might not be where someone's searching. I mean, it's an imperfect system. And just to clear it up, Adam says LGBTQ plus, Dave. So just to get that, I won't say to get it right. Yes, exactly. So it's very important. And there was something else in the comments. So Patrick was saying he doesn't have, like, paranormal is still homeless, doesn't have a category. So, how do you define yourself? Where do you put yourself? Where are people searching? And isn't it primary category only? That you can pick like in Libsyn, you can pick 3 categories, or how does that work, Dave? 3 categories and then a sub of each, or just?
Well, you could pick like your second category could be a subcategory.
Right. But only primary matters to Apple, right, Daniel?
Yeah, that's what they said, is that it's the most important one.
Because that's where you'll be found in any kind of top 200 list, right?
Right.
Is that how that works?
As well as the listing for your show, although does the new Apple Podcast app have this? I forget. Where, at least on iTunes, I would say at the top, the category that's from your first category.
Dave, do you have any general advice to people who are asking how they should categorize their podcast?
I always just say pick the one that matches what you feel is the best, and then don't worry about it. And what I always do is the minute I am listed in Apple, grab that link and put it on your website, because the last thing you want to rely on is search. in any app for the record. Spotify is starting to get not so great. Radio.com.
So great at what?
Finding, like, if you type in the feed, you won't find it. You'll find 5 other shows labeled the feed, but you have to type in Libsyn to find Libsyn's show called the feed. So their search just isn't very good. Or I don't want to blame it all on them. Maybe they need other things to make it easier to find shows or whatever. But I have people that have said, type in the name of my show and it doesn't show up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the truth. So when you do get listed, grab that link. There's a great plugin. Daniel, what's the name of that one plugin? Something subscribe. I forget the name. You might have heard of it.
Social subscribe and follow, maybe?
Yeah, there's a great plugin that will allow you to make really pretty subscribe links right on your website. So you could direct people to your website to subscribe. And then if you find people in search, that's great. But I don't know. I don't put a lot of stock in it.
Well, you shouldn't really be telling people to find you that way anyways, right?
Yeah. To me, the worst thing you could say is find me an Apple podcast. I'm like,
here's where the search does concern me a little bit. So we say, and I agree, don't tell people find me. Please never tell them that. But you also don't want to overload your sites. Yes, I made social subscribe and follow icons plugin for WordPress, and it has now, I think, 57 different icons on it. For the love of all things pod, do not put all 57 icons on your site. But what happens for those people who, like us, Dave uses Overcast. I use Overcast. Ray, what podcast app are you using now?
Yes.
Pocket Cast?
Yeah.
So we're all not using Apple Podcasts. So for all those podcast websites out there that link to Apple Podcasts, the Apple Podcast button is not relevant to us. So that's where
they did help out with that a little bit. You can now land on, anyone can land on it and play, but it's not obviously ideal for that.
Yeah, but if I want to subscribe to a podcast in my preferred podcast app, I do end up having to search because it's just not reasonable to have all of those subscription buttons on the website. So that's where I think it's good to say subscribe at myawesomepodcast.com or your favorite podcast app, but we're still depending on search to some degree.
Yeah, and maybe that's what, I was talking about it, people don't search that way, but it could be that you at least want to make it good for the minority of people who are answering like a call to action, right? So like that, it might not be that your numbers show that the most people are finding new podcasts that way, but there might be like the 4% who are really important because that 4% are actual intentional subscribers and they can't find your show and then they bail, right? Like you're saying, Dave, with the feed, like, I mean, most times people will jump through hoops to try to get something they want, but you don't just look at the numbers by themselves. You really have to take the quality or the reason behind why someone might be searching. And I think in this case, making it as good as possible. And it's crazy too, right? Because everyone reinvents the wheel. I've seen this done at work too. It's like, well, Google's figured out search a lot of cases, or at least has put in, massive, that is their business model. But everyone's got to redo it themselves, right? Apple Podcast learning, Spotify probably has to learn how to create search. And I don't know if this is a development issue or it's some kind of stubbornness, but we can't just plug in something to our system. Like, I mean, I know there are plugins for Google, like on your website. That WordPress is a good one. Like search can really suck on your own WordPress podcast site unless you plug in something else that does search for you, right? Daniel, you might know a little bit more about this, but I mean, it's crazy to me that we have to reinvent, that each of these platforms have to reinvent the wheel. So while 3 of them get it right, one is really far behind.
And when it comes to the categories too, how much are we wanting to make the categories replace search? Because when it comes to certain things like lifestyle decisions or whatever it is, are you really wanting a category? Or do you want to just be able to search and find the podcasts for that thing?
Relies on it a lot because I always go to new releases, right? Like what's new, and then or there's comedy. I think when you're watching a program like that, you're going for you have a general idea. Tonight I want to watch romance. Tonight I want to watch comedy, right? And action. So in those cases, I think, I mean, just judging on what I see when I open Netflix, it's pretty important categories.
Yeah, and those are very, very high level, top level categories. And I think like even having true crime as a top level category, that's one where I think
They're really catering to.
that shouldn't be
Let's just
there.
face it. Let's just face it. Not only do if you want to look, you want to make money in podcasting, start a true crime show. We've learned that. And that's actually what they say. Big money is in true crime right now. You know, that also, we don't need to start a whole nother roundtable, but I really, in a future roundtable, we'll talk about, and maybe we'll get like Rob Greenlee on here if he's still in the chat, but how much of this industry, so to speak, as using that as a very specific term, is driven by 1% of the podcast. It sounds like a lot. It sounds like a lot. A lot of the money coming in is being funneled through very few of the podcasts being produced. So bookmark that one. I want to go there.
So we're saying that 1%, that's 712 podcasts.
Well, I use 1% as a generic
I know.
elite. The more than, and so who was it? Was it Todd? I think New Media Show. And that's why I mentioned Rob. They came out with some stats where it was like, it was Todd talking about some stats, and who knows? Here's the case of, I don't know if it was the most recent episode. I just picked one that I hadn't listened to in a while. And he was talking about how, podcasts that get 500,000 listens per and above. I mean, we're talking, very few numbers here. Like get the 1 million above, the 500,000, you get the 45,000 to 100,000, and the drastic swings between how many podcasts there were when you break down like sort of downloads per episode over 4 weeks. That number, it was very fascinating. And we constantly are hearing podcast is exploding, and there's going to be a $2 billion business by next year and all this stuff. And that money comes from usually big brands. And I think a lot of it is not going across the podcast spectrum. I think these numbers like 2 billion is being propped up by very small percentage of podcasts, which on the one hand makes you worry, but on the other hand makes me super optimistic, because it's like, look how far we've gone on potentially not a ton of inventory catalog podcast. And like, wow, there's a ton of potential here. They always say radio is just leaps and bounds beyond podcasting in terms of revenue. But as we build that library and more shows come on board that find a really big audience, however you want to define that, maybe 500,000 more downloads per episode. I don't know. Seems like a lot of potential. I mean, it sounds like we're making really big inroads with not a ton of podcasts, and a lot of shows, a lot of podcasts it doesn't apply to. I mean, like none of my shows are in it for ad revenue, and that's why I say, man, most of these numbers that they talk about don't matter. Don't matter to me. Don't matter to a lot of independent podcasts, because CPM is not the way forward for a lot of podcasts.
Yeah, the numbers from Libsyn from Rob. This is from March, so this is a couple months old. Top 7% is 5,000 or above. That's 1 out of 14.
Right,
and that's
5,000. That's I would consider that small.
Yeah,
like on a scale of when we're talking about. I mean, 5,000 is the number Rob says that a lot of advertisers want to see to start with, right? That's a threshold. I mean, when you take that number up to 50,000, 100,000, like what would be considered sort of a prime time show?
Yeah. Well, in my notes here, top 2%, 19,000.
Top 2%.
Yeah, top 1%, 34,000 or above.
34,000 downloads you're in the top 1%?
Yeah.
Okay, it's even more dramatic than I was making it out to be when I said 1%.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's from March.
That's crazy. And I think it's actually good, because it tells us we've gotten real attention. I mean, we joke about Serial and stuff like that, but it brought real attention. And in theory, it brought some new money. And I think I say it all the time, podcasts do more with a little, something like that. You don't need a lot to do you can do a little, you can do a lot with a little with podcasting, something like that, right? And that goes with audience, right? We talk about, 1,000 people who listen to your show every week. You can do a lot more with that than, say, a TV network. They can't do anything with that. But a podcast could pretty much exist. You could make an income in theory off of something like that.
The math was off, by the way. It's 7,120, not 720 would be 1%.
Yeah, when I was in New York at an event, the producer of Missing Richard Simmons. Okay,
Dave has somewhere to go. This is good.
Yeah, Alexa, stop. But the producer of that said, I think it was 5%. If you gave her 5% of the budget of a TV pilot, she could make a whole year of a podcast.
Yeah,
and that's where I think you're going to start seeing more shows kind of be developed. Yeah. The pilot is going to be the podcast, and if it picks up steam, then it's going to follow the path of Lore and Homecoming and these other ones that have, been turned into TV shows.
Yeah, it's interesting. I said we wouldn't open up talking. We got there. I started going. I said, cut myself off. Like someone just stapled his lips shut, for gosh sakes. All right. Well, good. That's a good place for us to wrap. And I'll take some notes and then maybe approach, other people who think of the space. Paul, Evo, Rob, they all think of the space in these terms and always have good opinions. And then, of course, we'll get one of you from the audience on podcastersroundtable.com/guest if you want to appear. I will reach out to you, ask if you'd like to appear on a roundtable. If the time works, we'll bring you on. I will probably give you 24 hours notice or less. So be prepared. It's like a game show here. Who will make it to the roundtable? All right. That's the sign we need to go. Daniel J. Lewis, thanks for joining us. I don't know if you'll be here next time, but the chat has certainly enjoyed your presence. And so if you're not here, expect a lot of mentions.
Thanks. We'll see how my hit counter does.
That's right.
And you can check out my episode if it's already published or publishing soon at theaudacitytopodcast.com. And I want to leave you with this thought. Almost 3 million podcast episodes have been published in the last 90 days. So how are you going to make yours stand out and be better?
That is the trick. If only Apple would show it to people, mine would be better.
New and noteworthy.
That's it. I'm going to get in that new and noteworthy. My 8 weeks is up. Okay, Dave Jackson.
Yeah, Dave Jackson, schoolofpodcasting.com. This week on the School of Podcasting, I will be answering the question, what are the best ways to make money with your podcast? But step one is you do have to have an audience. So that could be a problem in some cases.
Such clickbait. Dave has figured out how to do clickbait. I love it. How to make money. I think every episode has like $sign emojis.
That's it. That's the title of every episode, regardless of what it's about.
Yes, exactly.
I'll just put in $1 million podcasts and et cetera, et cetera.
Tons of clicks until they start measuring retention, Dave.
That's good.
You're in the money. All right. Podcastersroundtable.com. Subscribe. Check us out. YouTube, all the places. We'll see you next time. Thanks again. Awesome to the chat. Chris, Patrick, Christopher's too. Chris and Christopher, thanks for showing up. Bangs, Adam, Dave Jackson. They're always doing it up in the chat for us. Thanks, Dave. All right. Wave goodbye. See ya.